Hey everybody, my name is Josh.
And I'm Amber.
And we're from Grace Walk Farm. You've probably seen us online, either on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, or even on YouTube. And we do a lot of things when it comes to canning, preserving food. There's been a lot of people that are interested in canning, a lot of questions that have been coming our way. And so we thought we would just put this video together to kind of give you a crash course in what you need to know to preserve your own food.
That's right. And a lot of times people are really scared of canning. I get questions a lot about what if my pressure canner explodes. You know, I think we all had grandmas that said, never pressure can, they can explode.
We've heard horror stories, and you've seen the pictures online where the microwave or the hood over the stove gets destroyed. Listen, we want to put your fears at rest today. There are potential hazards that can happen with canning. That's true. But the vast majority of the time, if you take the steps to be safe, if you know what you're doing, the chances of having a serious fail are going to be minimal.
Yeah, and modern canners are made with equipment that gives you protection from that. So we'll get into detail on that later, but from the beginning, we want to put you at ease that you can safely do this at home. And the reward for all your effort is you're going to have a pantry full of food where you know the ingredients, there's no preservatives, and you can safely feed your family.
All natural. So grab your notebook, take some notes along the way. Remember, this video is going to be yours to keep, so you can always come back and reference this if you have any more questions. And you can also reach out on the email link that's going to be listed on the video, hello@Grace Walk Farm. And if you want to send us an email, we'll get right back with you.
Yeah, and you can also visit our website, gracewalkfarm.org, and we have some recipes there for you and some other canning information. So let us know how we can help you be successful, and we're excited. Let's start canning. There is nothing like opening a jar of your own homegrown food to feed your family. For my family of 4, I have really worked hard to reduce our dependence on the grocery store and start producing our own food here in our backyard farm. On 3 acres, we're able to grow a large portion of our own food. As a matter of fact, we buy very little at the grocery store now. And thanks to home preserving, we have fresh food to eat even in the wintertime. So join me today. I'm going to take you on a little journey and show you the basics of home canning. Let's go to the kitchen.
All right, so let's get started with understanding your canner. If you're new to canning, this right here is a water bath canner. This is the gateway that most people use when they start canning and preserving their own food. It's the simplest method to use. It's usually the cheapest method to use. So the question is, what are you looking for in a water bath canner? You're really looking for a big pot. It needs to have 2 things. Number 1, it needs to have a rack inside that you can pull your jars out with. The second thing that you want to remember is that you want this pot to be deep enough that your jars will be able to have at least 1 inch of water over top of them. That's key. If you can't do that, then the pot that you're using will not work. Water bath canning is all about using high acid foods. So you can't use everything in a water bath canner, but one of the things that you can do, you can make pickles. Pickles are probably one of the first things you're going to learn how to preserve. You can use these in a water bath canner. You're going to have, I believe it's 10 minutes in the water bath canner, and your pickles will be ready. So that's the first one. The next one we're going to look at, I think Amber's going to talk about, and it's this one right here, the steam canner.
This is actually my personal favorite method of canning. And steam canning is kind of a newcomer to the scene. It was only recently tested and approved by the USDA, but as soon as I heard that it had gotten a stamp of approval, I ordered one because I wanted to test this out. You can use a steam canner in any recipe that calls for water bath canning and use the very same processing times. The advantage is a steam canner is a shallow pot and a big domed lid, and there's a rack in the bottom. And so you put 2 quarts of water, just 2 quarts, in the bottom of this canner, put your lid on top, and the steam that builds up inside is what causes your jars to heat up and seal. So while the water bath canner is going to require a lot of water and it's pretty heavy when it's full, this only requires a little bit of water, and so you can fill it quickly, it heats up faster, and it just makes the whole process a little bit easier. Highly, highly, highly recommend that you get a steam canner if you're looking to preserve food for your family.
This here is a pressure canner, and this is probably the one that you have the most questions about. It's probably the one that you watched your grandparents or your parents use. It's probably the one that you're most afraid of, because this is the one that people say will explode, destroy your kitchen, set your house on fire, and all the terrible things. X that out of your head. That's not true. Technically, it could happen. Most likely, it won't. Biggest reason why it won't happen is because today's pressure canner is not built like your grandparents' pressure canner. It has a lot of safety features that are already built into the structure, and if there is a failure, 9 times out of 10, even more than that, it will not explode. It will simply lose pressure. With that being said, let's look at the basic functions of a pressure canner and what you need to be looking for. First of all, this is a Presto pressure canner. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to find a reputable dealer, find someone that has a good review, someone that has a lot of years in business, someone that is trusted. Don't buy the cheapest thing that you can find. You don't necessarily have to buy the most expensive one, but don't buy the cheapest one because you will be disappointed. This Presto is kind of a middle of the road, maybe getting closer to the top end, but it's not the most expensive brand. Here's what you need to know about a pressure canner. It opens just like that. It closes just like that. Lid's not coming off because it has metal flanges that are secured all the way around the rim. So when you open it, here's what you see. You have some valves, and deep inside the pot here, if I can get it, you have a tray. This is where your jars are going to sit. What you want to do is you want to look at your canner because each canner could be different. Our canner has a line inside where we will fill it up with water. Typically, it's not even halfway full. It's probably more like a third of the way filled with water. Once you put your 7 jars in here, your water level will obviously rise, and then you will clamp it down. But before you do that, what you want to do is you want to look at this gasket. Every pressure canner on the lid has a rubber gasket. And it pulls out just like this. You want to make sure that it's free of debris, and it's also a good idea every week or month, depending on how often you're using your canner, is take a paper towel, put a little bit of cooking oil in it, and then rub your gasket through the oil. If you grease your gasket, you're going to get a better seal. The gasket's going to last longer. You won't have to worry about it dry rotting and cracking. Now, let's say you've got your seal greased, water's in the pot, you're ready to start. What are some things you need to look for on your pressure canner? First of all, when you start, this won't be on there. This is simply a weight. This gauge is going to tell you how much pressure is in the food. You have a vent here, and you have a vent here. As this pot is building pressure, and once it comes up to pressure, you're going to have steam, water coming out of this port. But once it gets up to a certain amount of pressure, this little stem is going to pop up, kind of like when you're cooking a turkey and the thermometer pops and it tells you it's ready. This is going to pop up, and it will keep any water or steam from coming out. If you build too much pressure, this is a blow-off valve, a safety valve, and you will get steam that comes out right here. Once this unit is locked in place, it's ready to go. So the question might be, what are some things that we can with a pressure canner? Well, here you see carrots, green beans, potatoes, and our favorite is bone broth. These are all things that you want to use in a pressure canner. So let's learn some more about the things that you might need as you're getting started.
Besides your canners, there's a few other things you're going to need to pick up and stock up on before you start canning. The good news is I've seen a lot of canning supply lists floating around online with a lot of unnecessary things. So we're going to show you the bare minimum of what you need, and I also am going to give you a few tips to find these items on a budget and save some money while you're at it. So the first thing is you need jars, right? Most obvious part of canning, you gotta have your mason jars. Jars come in lots of shapes and sizes, but the biggest difference is you're gonna see some that are wide mouth, and then you're gonna see some that are regular. And so the regular mouth has a smaller opening than the wide mouth. You can in both of these. You can only freeze in wide mouth, but you can in both of these. The key is you want to figure out which you like better, ultimately. They're both fine. You can also get smaller sizes. So this is a quart, this is a pint. So you may want to can some things in a smaller jar, or you could even go smaller than that and get little jam jars. This is like a half of a pint. Play around with the shapes and sizes you want. That's part of the fun of canning. But you can find jars for a pretty good discount if you're willing to do a little research. So my first suggestion is get on social media and make a post. Say, I'm learning to can and I'm looking for jars. I did this when I first started canning, and within a year I had more jars than I'll ever need. It seemed like everybody had jars laying around in their grandma's basement or their mom's garage, and people are happy to pass them on to somebody who uses them. So don't buy jars until you ask around. Check yard sales, garage sales, Craigslist, all those places, Facebook Marketplace. And you can also sometimes find canners that way as well, instead of buying a brand new canner. So along with your jar, you're also going to need a lid. Now, canning lids are a two-part system. First, you have your flat. This is the actual lid, and it sits right on top of the jar. And then you have a ring, and this is just a metal ring, and you put it on top of the little lid, and then you twist it, and that holds the lid in place, okay? Once you've processed your jar in the canner, you can take the ring off, because the lid will be sealed and it won't come off anymore. And you'll know your lid is sealed because, listen to this, when I push this in, when it's not sealed, you're gonna hear a pop. But if it's sealed, you won't hear a pop. Let me show you a sealed one. This is some muscadine jelly. Nothing. There's no give in that lid because it is sucked all the way down, vacuum sucked in. That's what canning does for it. And so you don't have to worry after it's canned about that ring. You can take it off. And that way you don't need that many of these rings. You only need enough to can 7 or 8 jars at a time. And then you can reuse them. Now, I will say for lids, there are lots of brands and there are lots of opinions on which brand is best. I personally use a variety, but my favorite have been the lids from 4 Jars USA. And so if you guys want to try that brand, you can use code GRACEWALK10 for 10% off of your canning lids. And we hope you'll enjoy those. Let us know what you think. We've had real good success with those. All right, the next tool you're gonna need is a jar lifter. Okay, this is a jar lifter, and you've got kind of a rubber on this side, and a lot of people don't know which way you hold it. Which way do you use it? So these are the handles. The flat part is your handle, and this part is made to pick up your jar. And it works like this, okay? And the purpose for this is when you are removing or putting your jars into a pot of boiling hot water, you don't want to do that with your hands. You don't want to do that with, I've seen people try to do it with tongs. You're just asking for burns. Don't do that. Pick one of these up. They're about $10, maybe a little less. And we've got that linked for you in the ebook download. So you need a jar lifter. You're also going to want to pick up a jar funnel. These are about $4 or $5, money well spent, and all it does is make it easier for filling your jars. And the funnel just sits right on top of the jar, like that, and then you can fill your jar without making a mess and spilling things everywhere. Very handy. I recommend you grab a couple of these just to have an extra on hand. I also recommend you get a good ladle, because honestly, when you're filling jars, if you have a big quality ladle, the work will be easier and you'll get it done quicker. So invest in a good ladle. I've linked my favorite one for you. And then you're also going to need a dish towel. And so after you fill your jars and you're getting ready to process them, before you put the lids on, you're gonna take a little dab of vinegar on your dish rag, and you're gonna clean the rims of your jar to make sure there's nothing sticky so you get a good seal. So you will need a little dish rag. The only other thing is you're gonna need either like a little butter knife or a plastic chopstick. And after your food is in there, you're gonna do something called debubbling, where you just stick in and around your food to get any little air pockets out before you put the lid on. They make fancy tools called debubblers if you want to buy one, but it's really not something you need to spend extra money on. A regular old butter knife will do for that. And that's it. That's really all the supplies that you need. What about if you're canning on an electric stovetop? If you don't have burners and you are using a flat top stove, how does that impact canning? Now, we have a flat top electric stove, so this is something we know all about, and we have experimented, and I can tell you we have been successful. We've never broken a stove, we've never cracked a stovetop. But we've also been told that you shouldn't use cast iron on flat top stoves, and that's pretty much all I cook with. So it's your stove, you decide if it's worth the risk. One thing you can do is invest in a pressure canner that's lighter weight. So the Presto that we use is an aluminum canner, which makes it weigh a whole lot less than some of the big heavy duties like the All-American. So we feel a little safer using that since it's a little lighter weight. But if you don't want to risk it, you can also get just a separate electric burner to can on, or you could even can on like a propane grill outside. There's lots of ways to work around it. Before we can start canning, we've got to get our jars prepped and ready. So let's go over the process for how to prepare your jars to begin canning and filling them with food. So first thing you need to know is how to prepare your jars. Do you need to sterilize them? In the old times, they would boil their jars for a good 10 minutes before they started canning to get them clean. But today we have a lot of modern conveniences and access to things that maybe our grandparents and great-grandparents didn't have as easy access to. And we've also had access to good lab testing. And what we have learned and what the USDA now recommends is that you do not need to pre-sterilize your jars as long as you're canning for 10 minutes or longer. And if you're pressure canning at all, you don't have to pre-sterilize. The reason for that is if there was any sort of tiny bit of bacteria hidden in your jar, you're going to be boiling the jar along with the food in it for a good amount of time as you process it, and that's going to take care of it. So you can sort of sterilize, process, and cook all in one step with the canner. So the way I prep my jars personally is I like to run them through the dishwasher on the highest heat cycle to get them good and clean. Some dishwashers will have a sterilized cycle. You can do that. But you want to make sure they're clean. Hot, soapy water is the bare minimum. And then once your jars are clean, you're ready to fill them with food. Now for lids, each lid manufacturer is a little bit different in what they recommend. Just like jars in the old times, people would boil their lids first. And that's because this little rubber seal around the edge of the lid, in older lids, they tended to be very hard. And so you would have to boil this for 10 minutes to soften that seal up to get it to adhere to your jar. They don't make them that way anymore. Today, the seals are already soft and pliable, and almost all of the brands do not require you to pre-boil them. So I do not pre-boil my lids. I just wash them with hot soapy water. That's really all you need to do is get everything clean. Work with clean surfaces, clean jars, clean lids, clean rings. As long as everything's clean, you're ready to start canning. So I'm going to pass you over to Josh, and he's going to walk you through our first canning project of the class.
Thanks, Amber. We're going to start with our steam canner, and I want to show you the process for how we do this. First of all, this is our steam canner. Here's what we're going to do today. First, we're going to take the lid off. I'm going to set it right here. The first thing that we're going to can today is water. Now, a lot of people are going to ask, why in the world would we be canning water? The reasoning for that is real simple. Number one, it's going to can the same way that we would can these pickles. It's going to take about 10 minutes in the steam canner, and that's for a quart jar. If you use pint jars, time is going to change, and you can find that information online as well. But for today, we're using quart jars. We're going to use normal mouth jars. They're not wide mouth. And that really doesn't change anything as far as the process of canning. All that's going to do is this jar has a shoulder and a wide mouth jar does not. Today we're using normal jars. So here's the process for steam canning water. You ready? We're going to get our jar. We're going to sit it right here. In fact, we're going to use 4 jars. And the reason we're using 4 is very specific. if you're like me and Amber, anytime you're going to can or you are canning, it's very seldom that you're going to end with the exact number of jars that you need. On a steam canner, you have to use at least 3 jars to do the process. You don't want to do 1, you don't want to do 2, and really, you want to do a full load if you can. So, just for the ease of use today, we're going to use 4 jars. That's 1 gallon of water. Somebody would say, well, why would you can water? For any of our friends that are living in hurricane zones or tornado alley, or if you've ever had to deal with no power for an extended period of time, you know how burdensome it can be. If you have no power, you have no water. So in this case, if you will can a jar of water every time you're running your canner, or if you want to, let's say you only had 4 jars and you had 3 empty spots, take those 3 empty spots, fill up 3 jars with water, put them on the shelf, and you will always have sterile water on hand. If you've ever been without power, you know how crucial it is to have water. You use it for everything. So keep that in mind. A lot of you have shown some interest in a little bit more preparedness when it comes to being prepared for food and unknowns in the future. You never know what's going to happen. This is a great way to start your preps, to be prepared, have water on hand. So here's what we do. We've got our jars here. I've already poured a gallon of water. Just for ease of use, I'm going to put my funnel in. I don't have to. I'm pretty good with this. We are going to fill these jars up, but we are not going to fill them up all the way to the top. We want to leave what's called head space at the top of each jar. And you want about 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch. I usually come up, I'll show you. I usually come up right here and I'll stop. And the rest of this is head space. There's going to be a little bit of air there, and you need that. That's important. So we're going to fill up all 4 jars. As you're doing this, now's a good time to be thinking ahead of the next steps, because one of the things that we're going to have to do after we get all of our jars filled up with water is we need to make sure that they are clean and they're ready to have a lid applied to them. I have already taken the time to set up beforehand. I've got some supplies over here I'm going to show you in just a second. Here's our last jar. Let's see how good I did in measuring my water. I think I did pretty good. I could probably put a little more in this one. All right, we're good. So here we have 4 jars. They are all filled with water. We're just before ready to can those. The next step is we want to make sure that this rim is clean. This is also a good time to run your finger across the rim and you're feeling for any imperfections in the glass, any chips, any high or low spots. If it's there, you'll feel it. If there's something stuck to it, you will feel it. And the reason you're doing this is because anything that is stuck to the rim is going to keep you from getting the vacuum seal that you need in order to properly can your food. In this case, the rims feel good. I know these jars are not cracked, but nonetheless, it's a good habit to get into. Next, I'll take a paper towel. If you want to use a dish towel, you can. I'm kind of a sucker for a good paper towel. So we'll take our paper towel, and I'm going to take white vinegar. It's really not good for much of anything around your house, but it is good for cleaning, and this is what we're going to do. As you can see, I've got a little bit of vinegar on my paper towel. Now I'm going to simply go around, and I'm wiping the rim of each glass. You can spin the glass like this if you want. You can spin around, or you can spin your hand, however you're comfortable doing it. Kind of like Bob Ross says, there's only happy accidents. We don't make mistakes, right? So the key is for you to be comfortable with what you're doing and to do it at your pace and do what you want to do. It's your kitchen. So now we have got our rims are clean, our water's in the jar. Now we want to take our lids. We're going to place a lid onto each jar, just like this. Then we want to take our rings and we're going to put them on, and this step is key. You don't want to over tighten your ring because you'll get a false seal if you do. You just finger tight. That's it. We're not looking for anybody that's going to slam it on there as tight as you can. I've got 2 older brothers. My middle brother, world's worst for tightening things as tight as they can possibly go. So Andy, if you're watching, don't do it that tight. Now, once you've got your rings on, They're finger tight. The next step is you need to put water in your canner. It just so happens that I have got 2 quarts of water right here already measured. Good news is that's what this canner requires, is 2 quarts of water. Now, if you don't have a steam canner, let's say you have a water bath canner. The good news is the process for canning in the water bath and in the steam canner is going to be virtually identical. The main difference is this: a water bath canner is going to weigh about 40 to 50 pounds. It's going to be full of water. It's going to be very heavy. It's kind of cumbersome. It's hard to move around. This is a lot easier. It doesn't take anywhere near the amount of time that a water bath canner is going to take. It's a better option. If you have no canner and you're looking to buy one and you're torn between a water bath canner or a steam canner, go with the steam canner. It does more. You'll be happier. Our water's in our steam canner. Now we're going to head over to the stove and I'll show you the next process. Okay, so we're over at the stove and we are moving on with our steam canning of this water. Again, just in case you missed the last segment, canned water is a must-have for your preps. It's a must-have for any canning shelf. You will always have sterile water on hand if you do this. Plus, it's a great way to round out a round of canning if you need to have 1 or 2 more jars to finish the batch. So keep that in mind. So here's what we're going to do. We take our jars and we place them just like this in the steam canner. There's not a right or wrong way to do it, but what you want to do is try to avoid the glass jars touching if you can. It's harder to do the more that you have in there, but you can do it. Now that we're here, here's what we like to do. I don't turn my stove on full blast, and this is a good reason to remember this. Glass does not like sudden temperature changes. Don't put a room temperature jar into hot or boiling water. It's a good way for your jars to fail. We've had that happen. We've made that dumb mistake a few times. So learn from our mistakes. Don't do that. You want to be gentle with your heat. So we don't start on high. In fact, our oven goes from 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 to high. So we put ours on about 8. That's about 3/4 of the way. And what that does is it gently allows the heat to rise up. And so now that the heat is on, we are going to place our lid on our steam canner. And what we are going to do now is wait for the steam pressure to actually build. We're going to look at our gauge. It's going to take probably 5, 10, 12 minutes for this dial to come all the way over here. And we are going to go into the dark green section of our dial. So while we're waiting for that to happen, I'm going to send you back over to Amber, and she's going to show you what the next steps are for pressure canning.
For our pressure canning project today, we are going to can some pinto beans. Now, let's talk for a minute about beans and canning beans. There are lots of different methods for this. The traditional method for canning beans is that you soak them overnight and then you boil them for 30 minutes and then you fill your jars and put them in the pressure canner. But beans have to process for a really long time in the pressure canner. For the small pint jars like these, they're going to have to process for 75 minutes. If I were doing quarts, it would be 90 minutes. And what I have found is that when I follow the recipe exactly as they suggest, my beans come out mushy. It's just too long at too high of a heat. So this is my personal method for how I can my beans. And I want to tell you up front that this is not the same method that you are going to find on the USDA website for pinto beans. However, this is the way I've been doing it for several years now, and we've never had any issue. The jar's still well, so I feel really confident and safe in teaching you this method. But as always, do your own research. Your kitchen, your rules. So we're going to start out today with 4 pint jars. These have already been washed in hot soapy water. I also have 4 lids and 4 rings. These have all also been washed. We have a container here of pinto beans, just dry pinto beans. And what we're going to do is we're going to get a 1/2 cup measuring scoop. All right, and we're going to take a 1/2 cup of beans and add them to each jar. Now, if you are doing quarts, you can put a full cup of beans per jar. But for our pints, we're going to go with 1/2 cup. All right. And you want to make sure that you've washed your beans ahead of time, pick out anything. I wash my beans and then let them dry before I store them in my pantry in this container, so I know they're good to go. We are filling our jars, and this is so simple. Beans are the simplest recipe ever. All right, so we've got our jars filled. Now, you can choose, do you want to salt your beans while they cook? Personally, I normally do not salt my vegetables, any of them, before I can them. Even my green beans, potatoes, I like to season them when I open the jar to cook them because I never know exactly how I'll use them. So these beans may end up in a soup, they may become refried beans, they can become bean burritos. So I'm not gonna add any seasonings to these. But again, your kitchen, your rules, and with canning, you can safely adjust the seasoning in recipes to make it the way you like it. Just be aware that some herbs can get a little bit bitter after they've canned. So for instance, like sage or basil, the flavor is gonna be way stronger after you've canned it. So personally, we just leave it out and we season later. All right, so our jars are ready. We've got our beans inside. The next step is we're gonna fill them with water. And just like Josh showed you when he was doing the water for the steam canner, you're going to leave 1 inch of headspace. So you're gonna leave a gap at the top. So we're gonna just go ahead and pour this in and leave them 1 inch of space at the top. Now, when you do this, just give it a second to settle and then look, and if any of your beans float to the top, pick those out. That's a sign that they're bad. And if they're good, they should all kind of stay on the bottom. So far I don't have any floaters. We're doing good. All right. So now that we've got our beans and our water, you could have also added salt and seasonings if you like. We're gonna add our lids. But what do we always do before we add lids? Do you remember? We clean our rims. So I have a paper towel here and I'm gonna put a little vinegar on it. I love white vinegar, so handy for cleaning, and honestly for canning is really when we use it the most. Use a lot of vinegar when you're pickling things, but also just for cleaning your jars. So I'm just running this over the edge of the rims of each jar and making sure we get any debris. This step is really important. Don't skip it because it can affect the way your jars seal if you don't do this. All right, now we're gonna add our lid. And don't forget, guys, you can get 10% off canning lids if you use Grace Walk 10 when you order your lids from 4 jars. And we've been real happy with their lids. So I think you will like them. And the thing I like about four jars is they have options where you can buy in bulk. So instead of buying a pack of 10 lids, you can get a pack of like 200. And for us, in a typical canning season, we probably put up 500 to 600 jars. And so buying them in bulk saves us a lot of money. So 4 jars is the way to go. All right, so we have our jars prepped, lids on, rings on. They're not too tight. They're perfect. They're ready to go. So we're gonna go check back on the steam canner and see if it's up to temperature. And then we'll start processing these in the pressure canner a little later. Do remember, you want your temperature to match. Whatever the temperature of your canner is, you want the temperature of your jars to match. So since I used plain room temperature water in these jars, we're gonna start our pressure canner with room temperature water. Just remember, if you start with cold jars, you need to start with a cold canner. If you already heated your jars and you filled them with hot food, you can put them straight in a hot canner. But don't mix and match because the temperature shock is one of the most common mistakes people make when they're canning, and it can cause your jars to shatter. So let's go check our steam canner, and I'll be back at the pressure canner to see you later.
All right, our steam canner is coming up to temperature. If you'll come in here a little bit closer, you can see our dial. It has actually moved. It was all the way over here. Now it's come here. We've got a little ways to go to get into the dark green before we can start our timer. But while we're waiting for that dial to get into the right area, I wanted to talk with you for just a moment about jar failure. What are some things that you could potentially expect to see? So, if a jar is going to fail, it's usually going to be in one of two ways. It will either be directly up here at the top where your lid buckles and it fails and it doesn't seal, or if the jar itself becomes compromised, it 9 times out of 10 is going to break right here on the bottom, right around the edge. And what happens is this is sitting in your canner, the temperature is going, it's under pressure, or it's in a steam canner, and what happens is you'll get a hairline crack and you'll hear it crack inside of the canner. And it's not loud and it won't be a lot of little pieces, it will be one big piece. It will just pop right off. So keep that in mind. That's why you want to make sure you put cold jars in a cold canner or warm jars in a warm canner. You don't mix and match because your jar will fail. When your steam canner is ready, you're going to notice it. You'll see that there is some steam coming out. This is not an airtight vessel. You'll notice steam's coming around. Come on in closer and look at our thermometer, our needle, and you'll see that it has come all the way around and it is in the dark green zone. And what that means is that we are ready to turn our timer on. So for water, we're going to do 10 minutes. So for what we're doing, I like to just set my kitchen timer. And that's it. From this point, walk away. You don't want to leave the room. You don't want to leave this unattended, but don't touch it anymore until it's ready. Our timer's going off. We can see that our gauge hasn't moved. It's been canning, steam canning for 10 minutes. So now, here's what you do. Turn it off, don't touch it, and walk away. You want this to settle back down. You want the temperature to come down naturally on its own. You don't want to move it. You don't want to shake it. You don't want to jostle it. Leave it alone. After about 20, 30, it may even be longer than that. After a set amount of time, you'll notice that the gauge drops back down. And at that point, then you can safely remove your lid. And you have successfully canned 4 quarts of water. So here we are, we're about 45 minutes later, and as you can see, this is still really hot. The gauge has come down. Something that you'll notice when you take the lid off, you're gonna have water on the top of your lids. And it doesn't matter which method you use, steam, water bath, or pressure, you're gonna have that, and it's okay. The next step is to remove this safely from here to a towel. You don't want to sit this directly on your countertop. It can burn, lead to problems. This is the business end. This is your end, all right? Grab it by the neck and gently place it right here. And you'll notice even 45 minutes later, these jars are still bubbling. That water is still hot. And the reason for that is because this was hotter than 212 degrees. And so it's going to take a little bit longer than normal to cool off. But that's the joy, that's the magic, if you will, of canning. Here's our 1 gallon, our 4 quarts of sterile water that can go onto our shelf. And we can use those anytime we want.
All right, let's start the pressure canning process. So I've got my pot already on the stove, nothing in it yet except the rack. Our first step is we need to add the water to our pot. Now I use a Presto 16 quart pressure canner. I have my exact canner linked for you in that Home Canning for Beginners ebook, so you can definitely look at that. So now we're gonna add, my canner calls for 3 quarts of water. So I'm gonna pour those in here. And every canner is a little bit different in what it calls for. So just read your manual when you get your canner, or if you found one used, you can usually find them online to read the manual for it. 3 quarts of water. And then I'm using room temperature water because if you remember, our beans and our water that we've prepped are room temp. And these beans are raw, okay? They're still hard. But what's gonna happen is they are going to cook as they can. And when we pull this out of the canner, these beans are gonna be cooked. So I'm gonna just stick these right inside my canner. Now for pint jars, when you're canning beans, any kind of dry bean, whether it's pintos, black beans, kidney beans, chickpeas, any kind of a dry bean, For pint jars, you're going to do 75 minutes, and for quart jars, you do 90 minutes. Once they're in your canner, they're not touching, we're going to put the lid on. Now, let's take a look at this and just review for a second. We have a couple of things to look at. This is our dial gauge. This is going to tell us the pressure level we're at. This is our weight, and we're going to remove the weight to start with because we're going to steam at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to show you what that means. And then here on the inside, we have our gasket. It's placed in the right position, and we are ready to go. So on your pressure canner, take note, it usually will have a little arrow to line up your lid with the pot. And you're just gonna line that up like that and then twist it closed, and it is sealed. All right, now I'm gonna turn my heat up to medium high. So about an 8, just like we did with the steam canning. And what I'm looking for at this point is I'm waiting for my water to heat up, for it to start to steam inside. And when that happens, steam is going to start coming from this vent right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to wait until we see a steady stream of steam. Once that happens, we set a timer for 10 minutes and we let it steam. Keep steaming for 10 minutes. That's super important. It doesn't matter what you're pressure canning, any food, you still do this. You have to let it steam for 10 minutes because what that's doing is it's allowing pressure to fill your pot. And then after 10 minutes, you're going to put your weight back on top like this, and it's going to stop the steam. And when you do that, this little knob right here will pop up eventually when it starts to reach pressure, and your gauge will begin to change. So you can look up online how long you need to can and what weight you need to can based on your altitude. If you have trouble finding that information, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to help you. For us, we are at 1,100 feet elevation here in North Carolina. And so we can at 11 pounds of pressure. So on my little gauge, I look for the 10 and then I go one little notch past that. So for now, all we're gonna do is just hang out and we're gonna wait on the steam to start coming out. And when it starts steaming, I'm gonna bring you back in so you can see what that looks like. And then we'll continue the process.
All right, we've got just under a minute left. And as you can see, we have a big column of steam that is coming out of our vessel here. And what that means is that this entire pot is filling up with steam. And just in case you didn't believe me, the gauge says that we're at about 2.5 pounds of pressure. So what you're trying to do is fill the pot with steam completely. And when this number gets to 0, we're going to take this weight and we're going to put on it. It's imperative that you pay close attention. Do not walk away. This pressure gauge has already started to go up. Once I put the weight on this stem, the pressure is going to build very quickly. It's at this point that you need to stand by the stove and you're going to have to manually operate your temperature control to keep your pressure under control. All right? So we're now at 5 seconds. I'm going to go ahead and put this on and then we're going to be ready to start. And just like that, the weight is on, the steam has stopped. We are building up pressure and the needle is already moving. You can see this needle moving as I'm talking. And we are going to go up for our area and for our elevation, we are going to go to 11 pounds. Once we hit 11 pounds of pressure, we will let this continue to pressure cook for the next 75 minutes, at which point we'll bring you back and we'll show you what you do at the end. Our gauge is showing 10 pounds of pressure. That means we are really close to being able to start. You'll notice I haven't started my timer yet, and that's because I do not start my timer until we hit 11 pounds of pressure. According to this, we're about 30 seconds away from hitting 11 pounds, I believe. It's quickly going. I have turned my heat down from medium high, and now I am down to medium low, and I'm actually going to take it a little bit lower than that. Every stove is different. You're going to have to babysit this pot. You can't walk away. If something happens, Oh well, you're stuck. You're married to your stove for the next 75 minutes. So we have hit 11 pounds of pressure. I'm going to start my timer for 75 minutes. And now we wait.
Our pressure canner has finished and it has come back down to 0. And so now we are going to open it up and see how our beans turned out. Check out our beautiful tomato soup that we're making for dinner tonight. Thanks for hanging out with us today for some canning practice, and I hope this has been helpful to you. Before we wrap up, I want to take a minute to answer some of your questions that you had sent in advance for this class, and some questions we collected from our Extra Grace subscribers. And we're just going to go ahead and troubleshoot with you on the things you had already sent in. So Josh is here with me. He's going to read us some questions, and we're going to try to answer and problem solve.
First question, where do you find trustworthy recipes?
So the USDA website is a really good resource. They have a lot of recipes listed. So that's usually the first place I look. You can also go to the Ball website, Ball that makes canning jars. They have a phenomenal website. They also have several cookbooks that are great. And if you'll hang out for just a couple of months and be patient with us, the end of spring to the beginning of the summer, I'm releasing a brand new book called Food Independence that is going to be full of canning recipes, and it's going to be all about taking food out of your garden and how to preserve it and turn it into meals for your family. So hang in, and I'll be sharing more about recipes soon. But also check in your ebook that you got with this class. There are some recipe sites linked in there for you as well.
Are we allowed to make our own recipes?
To an extent, you can. So with canning, it's important that you learn the methods first. So I would start out by following recipes. You can make adjustments to things like the seasoning level or the salt, but other than that, I would follow recipes while you're getting started. But eventually, you can swap some things up. So for instance, let's say you're wanting to can soup. When you can soup, you pressure can it, okay? If it has meat in it, you're gonna go 75 minutes for pints, 90 minutes for quarts. And the big rule with soup is no more than half of your jar is filled with solids. The rest needs to be liquid. So it doesn't matter what kind of soup you can, as long as you follow that rule of half solids, the rest liquids, you can play around with it and use those canning times. So it's really a matter of mastering the methods so you know whether you need to pressure can or steam can or water bath, and then you can sort of play around and make your own recipes.
Is it safe to can meat?
Yes, you can definitely can meat. You can can just meat, or you can mix meat in. Like I do a lot of like beef stew, vegetable beef soup, stuff like that. We can. So you always have to use the pressure canner if you're processing meat, and you're going to use that same long process time like we're doing for beans. 75-minute pints, 90 minutes quarts.
So how do I know which method to use?
In your ebook, I gave you a list that breaks it down with all of the most common things that people can, fruits and vegetables, jams and jellies, and I break down which kind you need, so that should get you going.
How do I know if a jar is still safe to eat?
So when you look at your jar, the first thing you want to check is that lid still on good? And you're going to mash. There should be no give in the top of your lid. You can also do the pickup test, okay, where you try to lift your jar by just the lid. If it's on there, you can do that. Pretty much if the seal has broken and you pull on it, it's going to pop right off. You'll know immediately. The other thing is it's going to smell funky when you open it if the seal's gone bad. And honestly, you'll probably find it in advance because you'll start to notice a smell or something that will make you go, oh, now, where is it coming from? But jar failures are pretty rare. If you're doing it correctly, it's not going to happen very often.
After I open a jar, do I have to put it in the refrigerator?
Yes. So these are shelf stable after they have been canned. But once you pop that lid off and you open it, if you don't eat it all, you got to keep it in the fridge. Because you've reintroduced new oxygen, new bacteria from the air, and it's no longer sterile.
Final question. Why is the liquid level falling after I can?
So that is common, and it is called siphoning. And actually, let's see, I've got one right here that it's happened. You see these green beans? My liquid level is here, and it was here when we started. So the most common reason that this happens is you either heated your canner up too quickly or you cooled it down too quickly. And rapid temperature change is what tends to cause siphoning to happen. And a lot of the liquid can kind of overflow from around the lid. So the best way to prevent that from happening is when you turn your canner on, heat it up slowly. And when you turn it off at the end, let it cool down all the way and come completely down to zero pressure before you open it. And that should stop the issue. So how do you store your jars once you've finished your canning project? There's plenty of options. It's always best to store jars in a cool, dark place. A basement or root cellar works really well. But if you live in a house where space is sort of a commodity that you don't have and you need somewhere else, try a bookshelf. We have found this works really well. We keep a bookshelf here in our dining room to put our jars on, and it helps me as a cook for my family to see the jars so that I'll use the ingredients regularly. They're also really beautiful. But when you store your jars, you want to be very careful to remove the rings, because rings can hide a false seal where if your lid would actually pop and not be sealed, you might not know it if the ring is still on there. So we remove the rings. And then the other thing is, it's really best if you can put your jars in a single layer on the shelf. But now, if you're cramped for space, the USDA does say it is safe to stack your jars too high as long as you are stacking the same kind of jars. So, for instance, if you're using regular mouth, you would want to only stack a regular mouth on top of it. Or if you have a wide mouth jar, you want to only stack a wide mouth jar on top of it. And that makes sure the weight is distributed evenly and it's not sitting directly on the seal of the jar to compromise it. But that's really it. You want it temperature controlled. You don't want to stick your canned goods out in like a garden shed or a hot garage or somewhere like that. You really want to keep them as cool and inside temp as possible to make it last. And then really, once you have stored your canned goods like this, they're going to keep for up to 2 to 3 years, really probably even longer. I have eaten a jar of green beans that my mother-in-law canned that was 13 years old, and I lived to tell the tale. So as long as the jar is still sealed, I consider it fair game in my house. But really, we aim to can the amount of food that we will eat in a single year so that it's constantly being rotated. And if I notice I have something on my shelf, I'm like, that's been here for 2 years. That tells me I can too much, and I can cut back on how much of that I'm growing. And it also will help me kind of adjust what I want to focus on for the next year. So for instance, I have a ton of tomato sauce on my shelf right now. We have a few more months till we start to harvest tomatoes again, but because I canned so much of it last year, I probably won't do a whole lot of tomato sauce this year. So you want to kind of keep an inventory of what you have, and that will help you manage your canning, especially if you're doing this really to feed your family. You know, some people like to can as just a hobby, but some people are doing this to replace the grocery store, and if that's the case, keeping an inventory can be really helpful. Thanks for canning with us today, guys.
Yeah, we had a good time. I hope that you learned something new.
See you next time.
Bye.